At my own graduation party, in the living room of the house I grew up in, surrounded by every aunt and uncle and cousin and neighbor my mother had invited to witness what she believed would be her moment of reflected glory, my mother looked at me across a room full of people and said, loudly, clearly, without hesitation, "Well, at least you finally finished something." The room went quiet in that particular way rooms go quiet when something has been said that cannot be unsaid. I stood there holding a plastic cup of sparkling cider, wearing a dress I had bought specifically for this day, with my degree, a bachelor's in business administration, completed with honors, achieved while working 30 hours a week to pay for it, sitting in a frame on the table behind me. And I smiled. Not because I was fine. Not because it didn't hurt. But because in that single moment, something in me that had been soft and hopeful and still, after 23 years of this, still reaching for her approval, quietly and permanently closed. And something else opened. My name is Nadia. And this is the story of how my mother spent 2 decades telling me who I wasn't, and how I spent the last 3 years becoming someone she never saw coming. Let me tell you about Linda Okafor, because you cannot understand what happened without understanding the specific architecture of her love, what it rewarded, what it withheld, and why the withholding mattered as much as it did. My mother is a brilliant woman. I say that without sarcasm and without the complicated resentment that comes later in this story. She is genuinely brilliant, sharp, driven, exacting, the kind of woman who could have been extraordinary in any number of professional contexts if the world she grew up in had been built to support women like her. Instead, she channeled everything, every ambition, every standard, every measurement of worth, into her children. Into one of her children, specifically. My brother Daniel is 4 years older than me and has been, for as long as I can remember, the organizing principle of my mother's emotional universe. This is not Daniel's fault. He didn't ask to be placed at the center. But he was placed there early and thoroughly, and by the time I arrived, quieter, less immediately impressive, a child who processed internally rather than performing externally, the template had been set. Daniel was the one she talked about. At church, at family dinners, to the neighbors, to her friends. Daniel's grades, Daniel's awards, Daniel's potential, Daniel's trajectory. By the time he was 16, my mother was already describing his future in a tone of voice she reserved for things that were finished and certain rather than still unfolding. And then there was me. I was smart. I knew I was smart in the particular private way that children who don't receive external confirmation develop, a quiet, internal certainty that exists entirely independently of whether anyone else can see it. I was curious. I was organized. I was the kind of child who read voraciously, who solved problems by sleeping on them and waking up with answers, who understood systems, how things connected, how structures worked, how small decisions accumulated into large outcomes. But I was not Daniel. And in my mother's framework, not being Daniel was its own category of falling short. The comparisons started early. Early enough that I don't have a specific first memory of them, they are simply part of the texture of my childhood, woven in so thoroughly that for a long time I didn't recognize them as comparisons at all. They felt like weather. You don't ask why the weather is the way it is. You just dress accordingly. Daniel's teacher said he's the best student she's had in years. We'll see how Nadia does. Daniel had this unit mastered by October. Why is Nadia still struggling? Your brother never had to be told twice. These were the small ones. The ambient, daily calibrations. The ones that, over time, establish a baseline for how you understand your own worth. But there were larger ones too. Specific, memorable, the kind that lodge in a child's memory precisely because of how much they cost. When I was 12, I won a regional essay competition. It was a significant competition, 300 entries, a panel of judges from local universities, a cash prize. I came home with the certificate and the letter of commendation and the particular glow of a child who has been recognized for something she worked genuinely hard on. My mother looked at the certificate, nodded, and said, "Daniel won the state science fair at your age. This is good, Nadia. Keep trying." I went to my room and sat on my bed and felt the glow go out like a match someone had pinched. I want you to sit with that for a moment. 12 years old. Regional essay champion. And the response from the woman whose opinion mattered most to me in the world was, "Good, keep trying." I kept trying for 11 more years. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part is what it did to the way I understood my own accomplishments. When the person who is supposed to be your first and most unconditional mirror shows you a reflection that is always slightly smaller than the real thing, you start to believe the mirror. You start to edit your own sense of what you've done, measuring it not against what it actually represents but against some imaginary version of what Daniel would have done in the same situation. You build a habit of diminishment. You become, without meaning to, your mother's best student in the class called you are not quite enough. I took that class for 23 years. I graduated from it, in a way, on the night of my graduation party. I need to tell you about Daniel too, because he is important to this story not as a villain, he isn't one, but as a context. Daniel had absorbed my mother's investment in him and done what people who receive unconditional investment often do. He had fulfilled the expectations laid before him. He had gone to a good university on a merit scholarship, gotten a degree in finance, landed a corporate job with a recognizable company, and by the time he was 28 was living a stable, respectable professional life that by most reasonable measures constituted success. He also, to his credit, had always been kind to me. Not in a way that acknowledged the imbalance, I don't think Daniel ever fully saw it, which is its own kind of blind spot, but in a genuine, brotherly way. He celebrated my accomplishments when he knew about them. He told me I was smart. He never participated in the comparisons. But he also never challenged them. And that silence, over years, became its own thing. There was a moment, when I was 17 and he was 21, when I tried to tell him. We were at a family cookout, and my mother had spent 20 minutes describing Daniel's internship to relatives in a way that made it sound like he was personally restructuring American finance, and then turned to me when someone asked about my plans and said, "Nadia is still figuring things out," in the tone you use for unsettled weather. Later, alone in the kitchen with Daniel, I said, "Does it ever bother you? The way she talks about you versus me?" He looked genuinely confused for a moment. "What do you mean?" I tried to explain. The comparisons, the diminishments, the essay competition, years of accumulated examples. He listened with the expression of someone hearing something they vaguely knew existed but had never fully assembled. "Mom loves you," he said finally. "She just expresses it differently with different people." He meant it kindly. It landed like an explanation for something that didn't require explanation, as though "she expresses it differently" covered the full distance between what he had received and what I had been given. I smiled. I said, "You're probably right." I went home and I thought for a very long time about what I was going to do. I started college at 19. 2 years later than most of my peers, because I had spent my post-high school years working and saving rather than going directly to a university my family couldn't fully afford and that I wasn't ready for emotionally at 18. This was another thing that became a data point in my mother's ongoing assessment: the delayed start, the community college first, the slower path. Daniel was on the dean's list by his first semester, she mentioned once, during my first year. "I know," I said. "You could be too, if you applied yourself." I was working 30 hours a week, taking a full course load, and maintaining a 3.7 GPA. I did not tell her this. I had started, around this time, making deliberate decisions about what to share with my mother and what to keep to myself. Not out of dishonesty. Out of protection. I had understood something about my mother's relationship to my accomplishments. She did not expand them. She compressed them. Every achievement I brought to her was run through a filter that reduced it to something slightly smaller than it was, measured against Daniel, measured against her expectations, measured against some standard that had been set years before I arrived. And so I stopped bringing her my achievements in the raw, vulnerable state in which they existed when they first happened. I started building walls. Quietly. Carefully. And behind those walls, I started building other things. In my second year of college, I took an elective course in entrepreneurship that changed the direction of my life. Not dramatically, there was no single moment of revelation. It was more like a gradual alignment of things I already knew about myself into a framework that suddenly made sense. I had always understood systems. How businesses worked, how people made decisions, how small efficiencies accumulated into significant advantages. The entrepreneurship course gave me language for what I intuitively grasped. My professor, a woman named Dr. Caldwell, who ran the course with the particular energy of someone who had built things herself and wanted to pass the knowledge on, saw something in me and made a point of telling me so. "You think in structures," she told me after class one afternoon. "That's rare. Most people think in events. You see the architecture underneath." I held on to that sentence like something precious. Not because I needed her validation, I had learned, by then, to generate my own, but because having your self-understanding confirmed by someone with the expertise to assess it means something different than confirming it alone. I took every course Dr. Caldwell taught. And somewhere in the middle of my third semester, I started building something. I want to be specific about what it was, because the specifics matter. I started a small consulting practice. Not a company with offices and employees, a side operation, real but quiet, that provided operational analysis for small businesses in my area. My skill was exactly what Dr. Caldwell had identified. I could look at how a business was running and see where the inefficiencies were, where the architecture was broken, what small changes would produce significant results. I charged modest rates because I was building a portfolio rather than maximizing immediate income. I told no one in my family. Not Daniel. Not my father, who was kind but passive in the way that fathers in households with a dominant personality often become. Not my mother. I was building behind walls. And the walls were holding. By my senior year, the consulting practice had become something real. I had 8 regular clients. I had a reputation, within a small but genuine professional network, as someone who produced results. I had income that was, by the end of that year, comparable to what I earned at my regular job. I also had something else. A partnership offer. One of my clients, a woman named Reese, who ran a mid-sized marketing operations firm, had been watching me work for 18 months. She was 12 years older than me, established, respected, and, I would come to understand, someone who had the same ability to identify structural thinking in other people that Dr. Caldwell had. Reese sat me down at the end of a project engagement and made me an offer, a formal partnership in a new division of her firm, focused on the operational consulting work I had been doing independently. The offer included equity. Real equity, a percentage of a real company. I remember sitting across from Reese in her office, hearing the specifics, doing the math in my head about what this could become in 3 years, in 5 years. And I remember, underneath the professionalism I was performing, feeling something that I hadn't felt in a very long time. Like I was standing on ground that was entirely my own. I said yes. And then I went home and I told no one. Because my graduation was 3 months away. And I had decided, very specifically, very deliberately, that the graduation party my mother was already planning would be the last time she spoke about me in that particular tone, in that particular way, in front of that particular audience. After that, everything would be different. But first, I had to let her have the moment. I had to let her say the thing. Let me tell you about the graduation party itself, because the details matter. My mother had planned it with the full force of her organizational capability, which is considerable. 40 people. Catered food, which was unusual for our family. A banner with my name and graduation year. Photographs arranged on the hallway wall. She had put real effort into it, which made what happened more complicated, not less. People arrived. Relatives I hadn't seen in years, family, friends, neighbors. The house filled with the particular warmth of people who are genuinely happy for you mixed with the performance of people who are there for the social occasion. My father hugged me. My aunt told me she was proud. Several cousins asked what I was going to do next. Business, I said. I have some things lined up. I didn't elaborate. I had been not elaborating for 3 years. Daniel arrived about an hour in, with his girlfriend and a bottle of wine, and made his way through the room with the easy social grace that had always come naturally to him. He hugged me, told me congratulations, told me I looked great. And I saw him, genuinely, without complicated feeling, as a person I loved who had always been placed in an impossible position by a woman who loved both of us but knew how to show it very differently. I wish I could tell you my mother's comment was the only thing that happened that evening. It wasn't. About 2 hours in, a conversation formed around my Uncle George, who was asking everyone about their professional lives with the specific interest of someone who had retired recently and found that other people's careers were more interesting than his own leisure. He got to me, and I said I had finished my degree and had some business ventures in development, and before I could continue, my mother, who was standing nearby, said, "Nadia has always taken the long road. She'll get there eventually." The long road. My uncle nodded with the neutral expression of someone declining to engage with subtext. I smiled. But it was what came 40 minutes later, when my mother was in the center of a group that included her 2 closest friends, my grandmother, and 3 cousins, and she was talking about Daniel's recent promotion, that things clarified. Someone in the group, meaning well, gestured toward me across the room and said, "And Nadia just graduated. You must be so proud of both your children." My mother looked across the room at me. And I looked back at her. And she said, loudly enough that the nearby conversations paused, with a smile that she probably believed was affectionate, "Well, at least she finally finished something." The room went quiet. I stood with my plastic cup and my dress and my framed honors degree on the table behind me, and I felt every person in that room recalibrate. Felt the uncomfortable shifting of people who had heard something they didn't know how to respond to. Felt the particular quality of a silence that exists when a wound has been delivered publicly and the only thing louder than the comment is the absence of a correction. My mother turned back to her conversation. I smiled. And in that smile, in that quiet, held, deliberate expression, I felt the last soft thing I had been carrying toward her finally release. I was done seeking. I was done trying. I was done bringing anything to a mirror that only knew how to make things smaller. And I was ready to show her what she had been looking at this entire time. The next morning, I made a list. Not an anger list. Not a grievance list. A strategy list. There is a difference, and the difference matters more than almost anything else I could tell you about what happened next. The strategy list had 3 sections. The first section was about what I was going to announce, and when, and to whom. The partnership with Reese was real and it was significant and it was time for it to exist in the world rather than behind my walls. I was going to tell my family about it, but not privately, not minimally, not in the way I had always shared things with my mother, which was a context that guaranteed compression. I was going to tell them in a context that made the scale of it undeniable. The second section was about the nature of my relationship with my mother going forward. Not revenge in the sense of punishment. Revision in the sense of truth. I was going to stop performing the role of the daughter who was still trying. I was going to become someone who lived fully and publicly and unapologetically in the reality of what I had built, and I was going to stop offering my mother the private access to my achievements that she had consistently used to diminish them. The third section was about the timeline. Because here is something I had learned, building a business over 3 years without telling anyone, timing is a form of power. Not the only form, but one of the most consistently underestimated ones. The right information at the right moment, delivered in the right context, accomplishes things that the same information delivered prematurely cannot. I had a moment in mind. I just needed to wait for it. 6 weeks after the graduation party, Reese and I formalized our partnership. The legal documents were signed. The equity structure was finalized. The new division, which we named the Operations Group, which was not glamorous but was accurate, had its first 3 contracted clients already lined up, 2 of whom had come from my existing network and 1 of whom Reese had brought over from her existing client relationships. I was, on paper and in reality, a co-owner of a company. I told no one in my family. I was waiting. The moment I was waiting for arrived, in a form I had anticipated but not in the specific shape I had imagined, 4 months after the partnership was finalized. My grandmother, my mother's mother, a woman in her late 70s who had always been the gravitational center of the extended family, announced that she wanted to have a formal family gathering for her birthday. Not a party exactly. A dinner. All the immediate family, several of the closest relatives, an evening at her home that she framed as wanting to see everyone together. My grandmother had been watching me my whole life with the particular attention of someone who knows more than she says. She had witnessed every comparison. Every graduation party moment. Every version of the conversation where my mother described Daniel's life and Nadia's potential. She had never intervened directly, that was not her style. But there were moments, over the years, when she would catch my eye across a room and hold my gaze for just a beat too long, and in that beat I always felt seen in a way that got me through the next stretch. When she called to invite me to the dinner, she said one additional thing. I want everyone to talk about what they're doing, she said. I want to know where my family is. Will you come prepared to share? Yes, Grandma, I said. Good, she said. And then, in the tone she uses when she is saying something specific rather than something conversational, it's time. I don't know, to this day, exactly how much my grandmother understood about what I had been building. I had never directly told her. But she had always been the kind of woman who knows more than she's been shown, because she pays attention to what people don't say as carefully as she pays attention to what they do. She knew enough. The dinner was on a Saturday in October. 14 people around my grandmother's table, my mother, my father, Daniel and his girlfriend, several aunts and uncles, 2 cousins, my grandmother at the head. My mother arrived in the specific state of preparedness she brought to family gatherings, a performance of put-together warmth that I had watched my whole life and now recognized, with the clarity of someone who has finally seen through a trick, as exactly that. A performance. Not fake love, real love, expressed through the only register she fully trusted, which was surface competence and social management. Dinner was the first hour. The food, the catching up, the comfortable noise of people who have known each other long enough that silence doesn't require filling. I was present in the way I had learned to be at family gatherings, attentive, warm, not broadcasting anything. My mother mentioned Daniel's promotion twice. The second time, she included the number, his new salary, with the particular pride of someone who treats their child's income as a form of personal achievement. I watched my grandmother's face at the second mention. My grandmother is not an expressive woman in public. Her face does not give things away easily. But I saw, for just a moment, the very slight tightening that I had learned to read as her version of, "We are getting to something." After dessert, my grandmother said, I asked everyone to come ready to talk about their lives. I want to know where my family is. She looked around the table. Let's start with what we're proud of. It went around the table. My aunts and uncles talked about their work, their children, their recent accomplishments. Daniel talked about his promotion with appropriate modesty. His girlfriend mentioned a certification she was working toward. My father talked about a project at work he was pleased with. And then my grandmother looked at me. Nadia, she said. Tell us what you've been doing. I had been waiting for this sentence for 3 years. I want to describe what happened in that room carefully, because the details are the point. I started at the beginning. The entrepreneurship course. Dr. Caldwell's observation about how I think. The decision, in my 2nd year, to start building something real rather than waiting for permission or recognition or the right moment that someone else would provide. The consulting practice. The clients. The 18 months of work that built a reputation I hadn't announced to anyone. And then I described the partnership. I described it in full, what the company did, what the operations group division was, what the equity structure meant in practical terms, what the current contracted revenue looked like, and what the 3-year projection was based on the clients already signed. The room was quiet in a way that was completely different from the quiet at the graduation party. That quiet had been the quiet of discomfort, of a wound delivered publicly. This quiet was the quiet of reassessment. Of a room full of people recalibrating what they thought they knew. I watched it move around the table. The aunts and uncles, recalculating the quiet niece they had filed under potential. My father, with an expression of wonder that was slightly mixed with guilt, because he too had let the template stand longer than he should have. Daniel, leaning forward slightly, the particular posture of someone who is listening with genuine attention rather than polite presence. And my mother. My mother's face went through something I had never seen from her in the direction of me. It started as the expression she brought to news she hadn't expected, a kind of momentary blankness, a processing gap. And then something moved beneath it. Not shame exactly, not yet, but a first encounter with the distance between the story she had been telling about me and the reality that had been developing while she was telling it. I watched her understand that the person she had called someone who finally finished something at her graduation party, in front of 40 people, without hesitation, had been, at that exact moment, 3 months away from signing partnership documents for a company she had built entirely alone, while working and studying simultaneously, without asking for help or recognition or so much as a word of encouragement from her mother. I watched her understand that the long road she had described me as taking had led somewhere she hadn't seen coming. I watched her understand that while she had been measuring me against her template, I had been building something the template had never accounted for. Nadia, my uncle said first. That's remarkable. Thank you, I said. My grandmother looked at me from the head of the table. And she smiled, not a large smile, not a performance. A quiet, specific smile. The smile of someone who has waited a long time to watch a particular moment arrive. I always knew, she said simply. I want to tell you about my mother in the weeks following that dinner, because what happened to her in that period is more important than any single dramatic moment would have been. She called me 2 days later. I let it ring and called her back the next morning, which was a choice, small but deliberate. She asked if we could have lunch. We had lunch at a restaurant near her home. She was quieter than usual, which was notable. My mother fills space with conversation the way some people fill silence with music, continuously, as a default state. The quiet she brought to that lunch was something she was carrying effortfully. She talked around it for most of the first hour. And then, when the plates had been cleared and we were sitting with coffee, she said something that cost her more than I think she entirely understood. I didn't know, she said. I know you didn't, I said. Why didn't you tell me? This was the question I had been preparing for. Not aggressively, I hadn't rehearsed a speech. But I had known it was coming, and I had thought honestly about the truest answer. Because every time I brought you something, I said, you made it smaller. Not on purpose. I understand that now. But the effect was the same. So I stopped bringing you things while I was building them, because I needed the building to happen without that. She looked at her coffee. The graduation party, she said. Yes, I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, I was proud of you. I've always been proud of you. I know that too, I said. But pride that only exists privately, pride that doesn't make it through to the actual person, is love that doesn't arrive. She looked at me with an expression that was complicated in more ways than I could name. Part grief, part recognition, part something that looked like the beginning of a reassessment she had been avoiding for a very long time. I compared you to your brother, she said. Yes. Too much. Yes. I didn't mean it to, she stopped. I know you didn't mean harm, I said. I've done a lot of thinking about that. Intent isn't the same as impact. And the impact was real. She nodded. Very slowly. We sat there for a while. Not comfortably, not yet. But honestly. And honesty, even when it's uncomfortable, is its own kind of progress. I want to tell you what happened with the business, because the business is not a footnote. It's part of the point. The operations group grew. In the first full year of the partnership, we exceeded our projections by 22%. Reese and I made good partners. She brought the established client base and the industry credibility. I brought the structural thinking and the operational methodology, and the combination worked in the way that genuine complementarity works, better than either of us would have been alone. By year 2, we had a staff of 4 beyond the 2 of us. By year 3, we were being written about in a regional business publication as an emerging firm in the operational consulting space. The publication ran a short profile. A photograph. My name. The company's numbers, which by that point were significant enough to be genuinely notable. My mother called me the day the article came out. She had been sent a copy by 3 separate family members before she saw it herself, which told its own story about how information was now moving through the family in relation to me. I read it, she said. Okay, I said. It's wonderful, Nadia, she said. And her voice, I want to be precise about this, her voice had something in it that I had heard her use about Daniel my entire life. The particular warmth of someone who is describing an accomplishment they have fully received. Directed at me. For the first time. I didn't cry. I had processed too much of this too carefully to respond with tears in that moment. But I felt something shift. Not forgiveness exactly, I had done most of the forgiving privately, in the years of building, which had been their own form of letting go. Something more like recognition. She was trying. Genuinely. In the only way she knew. Thank you, Mom, I said. But I want to be honest with you about what changed and what didn't, because this story is a true one in the way that I mean when I say something feels real, and true stories don't end cleanly. My mother did not transform. She did not become a different person. She still, occasionally, said things that compressed rather than expanded. Old habits are the deepest habits, and my mother's habit of measuring her children against each other was decades in the making. But here is what changed, it no longer reached me. That is the actual revenge. Not a dramatic confrontation, not a public humiliation, not watching her suffer consequences that mirror what she made me feel. The real revenge was this: I became someone whose foundation was so solid, so entirely my own, so built on ground she had never touched, that her measurements couldn't find purchase anymore. You cannot compress something that is no longer presenting itself for compression. I had taken myself out of the mirror. Built my own. And the reflection in my mirror had nothing to do with Daniel, or her expectations, or the long road, or the person who finally finished something. It had to do with me. Only me. What I had decided, and built, and become, in the quiet years when no one was watching. Daniel and I had a conversation, about a year after the family dinner, that I want to tell you about because it completed something. We were at his apartment for a small gathering, and at the end of the evening, when everyone else had gone and we were doing dishes in his kitchen, he said something that surprised me. "I owe you an apology," he said. I looked at him. "I knew," he said. "Not all of it. But I knew the comparisons were happening. And I never said anything. I told myself it wasn't my business, or that Mom didn't mean it, or that you were fine because you always seemed fine." He paused. "You seemed fine because you were dealing with it yourself. That's not the same thing." I thought about what to say. "You weren't the one doing the comparing," I said. "No. But I was the one being compared to. And I could have pushed back and I didn't." He looked at me directly. "I'm sorry, Nadia. I had not expected this. I had made my peace with Daniel's part in this story in the way that I had made peace with most of it, privately, in the building years, as a condition of being able to move forward cleanly. But hearing him say it explicitly, with the directness of someone who had done his own thinking and arrived at his own accounting. "Thank you," I said. "That means something." "What you built," he said. "Without telling anyone. Without asking for anything." He shook his head slightly. "I don't know if I could have done that." "You didn't need to," I said. "You had a different path." "I know. But yours was harder." "It was," I said simply. "And it made me who I am." He nodded. We finished the dishes. "I want to end by telling you something that I have thought about many times since everything I've described, something that feels like the truest thing I can offer. There is a version of my story where the central drama is my mother, her comparisons, her favoritism, the graduation party comment, the ways her love arrived misshapen rather than whole. That version is real. Everything I described happened. But the central drama of my actual life is not my mother. The central drama is the choice I made in the years between the graduation party and the family dinner. The choice to build rather than react. The choice to keep my walls up not out of shame or fear but out of the specific strategic understanding that some things need to grow in protected conditions before they're ready for air. The choice to believe in myself at full scale, in private, before I ever required anyone else to see it. My mother spent 20 years trying to show me my reflection. What she showed me was her own limitation. And I spent 20 years slowly, painfully, necessarily understanding the difference between the two, between someone else's limited mirror and the actual, full-dimensioned reality of who I was. When I finally showed my family that reality, when I sat at my grandmother's table and described, calmly and completely, what I had built, the room went quiet not because I had done something dramatic. The room went quiet because the truth, when it has been patiently, carefully protected until the right moment, lands with a weight that no performance can match. I am not going to tell you my mother is now the mother I always needed. She is not. She is a woman who loves me in a limited way and is, slowly, learning to expand those limits. That is enough. It has to be enough, because waiting for the full version of what you needed from a person who was never going to provide it is how you spend your life in the anteroom of your own existence. I stopped waiting. I started building. And the building, not the confrontation, not the public moment, not any single dramatic scene, the building is what saved me. If you are watching this and you are the one who has been compared, the one who grew up in the shadow of someone brighter or louder or more immediately impressive, the one who was told, in 100 ways large and small, that your version of things didn't quite measure up, I want you to hear this. The mirror they handed you is not your face. It is their limitation, wearing your shape. Set it down. Stop looking into it. Build something so real and so entirely yours that the question of what it looks like in someone else's reflection becomes genuinely, permanently irrelevant. The most powerful thing you will ever do is become undeniable to yourself first. Everything else follows from that. My mother called me someone who finally finished something. What I had actually done was build something she couldn't see, couldn't reach, and couldn't reduce. I finished it a long time ago. I was just waiting for the right moment to let her see it. Some doors, when they finally open, Reveal rooms so much larger than what anyone imagined that the people who doubted you don't have words for what they're looking at. Make that room. Fill it completely. Then open the door.